told me I could read for 4 straight hours, and there's coffee being prepared. No, you guys, I'm really close to finishing this big fat novel, and I mean, like really close. But I'm going to read from an essay. I'm also working on a bunch of essays, which I'm actually writing for like 30 years. And I'm not going to assume that everybody knows who the great Raymond Carver was, but he's still considered. I know it's a limited audience. Yeah, good. But he is considered, along with my dead dad, to be one of the greatest short story writers America ever produced. And so I'm going to write an essay. I'm going to read an essay about those 2 men. And thanks for listening. Let's just have a conversation. That's my favorite part. And thanks for supporting this really great festival. And one more thing. How about Liz Strout? If you haven't read any of her work, Start Anywhere, but I just finished her latest. I've read all her books. My Name is Lucy Barton. It's one of the most special novels I've ever read, and I don't even know how she did it. Yeah. Carver and Dubus, New York City, 1988. It was 1988, the year we would lose Raymond Carver, and I was in a crowded room in New York City making my way to where he stood up against the wall. He wore a jacket and tie and held a glass of water close to his chest. He looked like he was trying to lie low, though he was at the height of his fame in a room full of writers, so this was hard to do. This is on the Upper West Side at the awards ceremony for the American Academy of Arts and Letters. I was there with my sister Suzanne and a few close friends, and we'd all driven down in a convoy from north of Boston with my father, the short story master Andre Dubus, who just won the Gene Stein Award for his volume of selected stories published that year. Less than 2 years earlier, our father had stopped his car on the highway to help 2 young people who'd been in an accident, and he was run over at 58 miles an hour, suffering 34 broken bones and 2 pulverized legs, one of which had to be amputated below the knee. Not long after this, his 3rd marriage ended, and his wife left him and took their 2 young daughters, my half-sisters, with her. So now my father lived alone in a small house on a hill of poplar trees in the rural part of Haverhill, Massachusetts. And we all did what we could to help out. My brother Jeb and I built wheelchair ramps and installed wall railings and made his bathroom accessible for a wheelchair. My sisters brought meals and encouragement. 3 times a week I drove over to his house to help him get his strength back with the weight training he used to love. And on Thursday nights, 10 to 15 writer friends would gather in his living room for a workshop he taught free of charge. It began as a way to bolster his spirits, to bring him back into the warm folds of community, but it quickly became a master class taught by my father. It had been a hard and dark time for him, and so when he learned of this new accolade for his work, this piece of good news gave birth to a much-needed good trip for us all. We drove down in 2 cars, my father behind the wheel of his handicapped-accessible Toyota, his wheelchair stowed in a compartment installed on the roof of his car. My sister Suzanne and her husband rode with him, as did our father's loyal friend Jack Hurley. He was a writer and a self-employed carpenter, and not long after my father's wife left, Jack moved in to do whatever needed to get done. I rode with an old friend of mine in his car, a dancer and poet who had been one of my father's students 10 years earlier. He was looking forward to watching his friend and former professor receive his award down in the big city, as was I, but we were also looking forward to seeing and maybe even meeting some of the major American writers we knew would be there. Men and women whose work had reached in and done something to us. This was before the internet and Google, but I knew from the invitation back at my father's house that literary giants had been invited. E.L. Doctorow and Joyce Carol Oates, Saul Bellow and Norman Mailer, Susan Sontag and William Styron and Allen Ginsberg, and the great short story writer Raymond Carver. Before hitting the road, as my father transferred himself from his wheelchair to his driver's seat, hooking the chain that would then hoist his chair up into its container on the roof, I told him I was looking forward to seeing all those writers. Yeah, he said, "I just want to meet Carver." We all knew he was to be inducted that day into the academy itself, that he was sick with brain cancer and had been sober for the last 10 years when he had written and published some of his finest work, that he too had a volume of stories come out that year, Where I'm Calling From, New and Selected Stories. As Jack Hurley got into my father's car, I saw that he had that thick volume in his hands. I was 28 years old then and had been writing fiction daily for nearly 7 years. I had published 3 short stories, and after nearly 40 rejections, my first book, a story collection, had been accepted by a New York publisher and was coming out in hardcover in early 1989. I wrote every morning in a tinted bar at an Irish pub at night, 10 Center Street. I lived in a rusted-out trailer across from a row of weathered beach houses on the Atlantic, Island. I love being local. And I spent a lot of time reading and studying what made great writing great. All I wanted to do, other than pay my bills and work out daily, was to learn to write as well as I possibly could. Yet I was still surprised I was doing this at all. That a handful of people, like my dancer-poet friend in that car driving behind my father's, were beginning to think of me as a writer when I never would have called myself that. I have written about this in other places and won't go into it here, but writing came to me unbidden, and had gotten me off a violent and self-destructive path, the kind a few other young men I'd known growing up had not gotten off of, and they had gone to prison or died young or both. I had a book coming out, yes, but my father was the writer, not me. I was just his oldest son with the same name who loved to write. I felt sure that any day now, my real life would present itself, and I would go on to do something else, even though I knew I would no longer be me if I stopped writing. Though I was also keenly aware, as were many others, that as accomplished an artist as my father was, his work was not read by nearly enough people. His book advances had always been low, as had the sales of his books. Most of the overwhelming majority of the stories he published had come out in literary journals and small circulations, yet he was a writer's writer, a man who had worked diligently his whole life on the form that he found in his late 20s when he discovered the short stories of Anton Chekhov. My father's first book, The Lieutenant, published in 1966, was a novel, a far more commercial form in the United States, yet he would never write another and was happy to devote his life to an art form many considered obsolete. But then in the late 70s came the stories of John Cheever and now Raymond Carver, and this view of the short story began to change. Their stories were published widely, and their books sold well and won big prizes. The stories of John Cheever, published in 1979, won the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the National Book Award. These developments my father celebrated, not so much because he had hopes more cultural light would shine on his own work, but because he deeply admired the art these two writers made. For if my father had been anything in this life, he had been generous and he had been humble. The first Carver story I read was what we talk about when we talk about love. I was dating one of my father's students, and she handed it to me and said, "Now this is good writing." I read it right away and thought it was even better than that. I was immediately struck by the narrator's voice, its vaguely blue-collar, this is how it is tone. And I liked how Carver began in the middle of the story. Quote, "My friend Mel McGinnis was talking. Mel McGinnis is a cardiologist, and sometimes that gives him the right." I liked how Carver then takes us and the narrator Nick immediately into this conversation between two couples drinking before dinner, and I found myself admiring how spare the sentences were and how that magnified the physical gestures of the characters, like Nick touching the back of Laura's hand, or Mel emptying one bottle of cut-rate, lousy gin only to open another. And I, whose own early stories had a lot of action in them, much of it violent, was so impressed with all the drama realizing itself solely through authentic dialogue between these very real men and women on the page, all of whom were being painted without any authorial judgment whatsoever. When I finished reading that story's last line, I could hear the human noise we sat there making, not one of us moving, not even when the room went dark. I felt that I was sitting alone in that dark room, drunk with my friends and my girlfriend Laura, dumbfounded on the true nature of love. Years later, I would read this definition of art from Leo Tolstoy. Art is transferring feeling from one heart to another. With every Carver story I read, that was happening. From the grief-stricken parents in A Small Good Thing, to the aggrieved wife in So Much Water So Close to Home, to the revelation of the stoned and jealous husband in Cathedral, Carver's art was going inside me and doing something substantial. My father's stories, also deeply realist, yet suffused with his Christian faith, were equally powerful. Each of his characters rendered with the same sort of compassionate tone and non-judgmental hand, one I knew Carver admired, for my father had heard from several writer friends that Carver would consistently teach my father's stories in writing classes, and my father did the same with his. Now the two would meet for the first time. Raymond Carver fighting terminal disease, my father without the use of his legs and still in quite a bit of pain, but driving cheerfully ahead of us down the highway for New York City, the mid-morning sun shining on the wheelchair roof box, a USMC decal on his back bumper. People who live in wheelchairs have to put up with indignities the rest of us never even have to think about. Where to park if there's no handicapped parking space. How to maneuver your wheelchair between cars and up and down ramps, if there are ramps. And if there are only stairs, is there an elevator too? And if not, what then? What about when you make it out of the garage? How do you make it down the sidewalk and off its curb without falling over in the street? How do you get up over another curb, then another, and another? And if you get to the building you're hoping to enter, is there a ramp, or will you have to be carried upstairs just to get inside? And once inside, are there stairs to face before you get to the room where you need to go? Or is there an elevator? And if so, is it wide and deep enough to accommodate a wheelchair that needs to turn 360 degrees so the man or woman or child sitting in it isn't facing the back wall? And what about bathrooms? Or that people who sit in wheelchairs in crowded rooms are stuck looking at other people at waist level. And when these people finally take the time to look down and address this man or woman in the chair, they tend to speak louder and more slowly, as if whatever has put this fellow human being in a wheelchair has also robbed them of their faculties too. In the last 12 and a half years of my father's life, I watched him have to live through all this again and again. When we got to the Upper West Side, the nearest parking garage had no handicapped space and no elevator, so I and Jack Hurley and my friend carried my father in his chair down 2 flights of concrete steps, and we took turns lifting my father up and down curves along crowded sidewalks. When we got to the grand building that housed the American Academy of Arts and Letters, there was no wheelchair ramp, so we had to carry him in his chair up 3 flights of stairs to a room crowded with well-dressed men and women, some of whom I recognized right away from their dust jacket photographs. There was William Styrman talking to an older man and a much younger woman. There was Joyce Carol Oates in her curly hair and famous round glasses. Over in the corner, I saw E.L. Doctorow in a dark suit, his beard graying, his eyes bright with intelligence and a kind of mischievous good cheer. The room was packed with writers and editors and literary agents, most of them holding a drink or glass of wine, the din of their voices rising all the way to the vaulted ceiling and back. A few glanced over at us coming in, their eyes on us briefly before dropping to the man in the chair. Some nodded respectfully, and maybe even a few others recognized him. But most went back to their conversations, and my sister and I had to do what the loved ones of people in wheelchairs nearly always have to do in crowded places. We had to move ahead of him in his chair to clear an opening that our father could roll through. My father stayed cheerful for this. He was dressed in a short-waisted white suit jacket and an open-collared maroon silk shirt, his thick gray beard neatly trimmed, his chest hair curling over his top button. As we pushed him through, he said hello to a few people, and a beautiful woman in black leaned down and hugged and congratulated him, and he thanked her and hugged her back. We were making our way to a side table beneath the window. Late afternoon light streaming in. Suzanne pulled away a chair and Jack rolled my father into place. My dad fixed his wheel brakes and wiped sweat from his forehead and smiled widely at me. I asked him if he wanted a drink, and he said, "Just some water, man," and I was off. I walked through the crowd and got in line at the bar. While waiting there, I recognized Calvin Trillin, talking to a tall man who looked very much like Arthur Miller. I saw others I vaguely recognized too, and I became aware of all the hard-earned accomplishment in that room, of all the sentences that had become paragraphs, that had become long passages and chapters in fine books, all written by these men and women. I was a grown man, but I felt like a child. I ordered a beer and a glass of water. As soon as I got back to my father's table, he thanked me and said, "I can't move in this room. Go find Carver for me, man." Me? That would mean I would have to talk to Raymond Carver myself, that I'd have to ask him to follow me. I felt instantly shy, but said, "All right." I set my beer onto the table and stepped back into the crowd. It didn't take me long to find him. He was the man standing alone against the wall with his glass of water, and his face looked just like his face in his books, long and clean-shaven, his hair short, his eyes lit with an earnest sincerity. I walked up to him, my mouth suddenly dry, and said, "Mr. Carver?" "Yeah." He did not smile, but he did not smile either. "My name's Andre Dubus." He looked confused. "Same name as my dad, the writer. He wants to meet you, but he can't get over here in his wheelchair." "He's here?" "Yeah, follow me." Then I was leading Raymond Carver through the crowd. Quite a few people looked over at us, and I could see they knew very well who was following me, though they did not know me, but now thought perhaps they should. I began to feel I was being thrust into the light of some positive attention I had not earned, and I wanted to get Carver quickly to my father, then recede into the shadows. When my father saw us emerge, he smiled and opened his arms for Carver like he was a friend he hadn't seen in years. "There he is," my old man said. "There he is." Carver leaned down and hugged him, and my father held him tight, patting his back and telling him to have a seat. My sister and her husband stood behind my dad holding drinks, and they introduced themselves, as did Jack Hurley, who sat in the chair against the window, Carver's new hardcover on the table in front of him. Raymond Carver glanced at it and sat in the only other chair at the table. It was directly across from my father, and instead of disappearing, I knelt on the floor between the two men, my back to the talking, laughing crowd. I had the sense that something truly momentous was happening, and I was getting to see it. Raymond Carver and my father both leaned forward and began to speak quietly. It was as if they were picking up a conversation they'd had long ago somewhere else, that they did this every time they met again, though they never had. My father pointed to his own forehead and said, "How is it?" "They've got me on steroids." Carver said a few other things about his cancer treatment, but then his eyes dropped to my father's wheelchair. He nodded and said, "You? How are you getting along?" My dad spoke very briefly about living in a wheelchair, and it was clear he saw the other man's plight as so much tougher than his own and did not want to talk about himself at all. He seemed grateful to be interrupted when Jack Hurley held up where I'm calling from and asked Raymond Carver if he'd be willing to sign it. The room had gotten louder somehow, and the crowd seemed to be moving, the award ceremony starting soon. I couldn't hear what Jack was saying to Raymond Carver, though twice Carver glanced down at me and nodded with a kind of respect I did not understand or feel even remotely worthy of. My father began to tell Carver how much he loved his work, and Carver said he loved his too. And now a handsome red-haired woman with a name tag pinned to her blouse came up to Carver to whisk him along, and he put his head down and signed Jack's book. He reached out and grasped my father's hand. My father said, "I love you, man. I love you too." And Raymond Carver stood and followed the woman into the streaming crowd and was gone. There was more to that afternoon, of course. There was the moment Raymond Carver was inducted into the academy. He was sitting on stage with all the other Academy members, dozens of the most celebrated and revered writers of our time, and when his name was called, he stood slowly, shyly it seemed, his sports jacket bunched at the shoulders as he was given a standing ovation. There were sitting in the audience as my father's award citation was read, and those of us who had driven down with him all hooted and hollered out our love and pride. There was the party after the ceremony, and my friend meeting William Styron and telling him how much he loved to lie down in darkness, and Styron thanking him sincerely. There was sitting at a table next to Allen Ginsberg and having him introduce my friend and me to his Indian publisher. Ginsberg asked what I did, and I did not tell him I was a writer. I told him I was a bartender. You like it? Yeah. That's good, right? Yes. I never saw Raymond Carver again that afternoon and early evening, nor did my father, but it was a joyous day, and we all got joyously drunk and stayed in some hotel none of us could afford, then drove north the next day, cheerfully hungover. When we finally drove up the hill of my father's driveway at dusk, the sun behind the ridge of maples on the other side of the road, my father tired but looking happy as he pressed the button that began to lower his wheelchair down from its roof box, Jack handed me a copy of Where I'm Calling From. He opened it to its title page, and there, in small, careful penmanship, Raymond Carver had written, "For Andre III, with my congratulations, Ray Carver." Jesus, Jack. Congratulations, brother. He hugged me, and I thanked him for what I thought was too generous a gift to have been given. I said goodbye to my father and sister and brother-in-law. I dropped off my buddy and headed back to my trailer near the beach. I lay on my mattress and opened Jack's gift and began to read all the Carver stories I had not yet read, and I reread the ones I already knew and loved. I did this till I read every page. And every now and then I turn to the title page and read what he wrote to me, and again I feel unworthy of his congratulations, for I had such a long, long way to go. 24 years later, I stood in that same grand building on the Upper West Side, this time to receive an award for one of my books. It was a warm afternoon in late May, and I found myself standing in that same crowded, sunlit room, and many of those same literary luminaries were there too. I met and spoke with Joyce Carol Oates and Calvin Trillin, with E.L. Doctorow and Jhumpa Lahiri and others whose work had moved me, had made me want to write better than perhaps I ever could. The actress Meryl Streep was there, as was 93-year-old Pete Seeger. Everywhere I looked, there was a face that belonged to a name, that belonged to a body of work that had contributed to our culture, that had somehow illuminated truths that make the rest of us more awake and realized and alive. Soon it was time for the award ceremony, and as the room began to clear, I kept glancing back at that same window where in 1988 there had been a small table and where two great American short story writers had finally met. Raymond Carver would die months later, my father 11 years after that. Pete Seeger has now joined them, as has William Styron and Allen Ginsberg and E.L. Doctorow. And as I write these words now, I think of how death is forever stalking the creative writer to get his or her work done, no matter how he or she feels about it, and how grateful I and so many readers are that Raymond Carver, in his short time here, made it to the desk each day, as did my father, setting the brakes of his wheelchair before picking up his pen. And I keep thinking how these two men both professed their love for one another that afternoon, when each had only known the other for his work, for his stories, for his art, which has endured for both, and that, yes, will continue to be endured as long as there are readers who will take the time to open their books and read them. Thank you. How many of you know the work of Jim Harrison, the great writer from UP, Michigan. See, not enough hands. You guys, go check out. I'm giving you a gift. Jim Harrison. He wrote 40, 50 books in his life. He was one of those rare writers who wrote poetry and prose equally beautifully. He also had a few films made. Legends of the Fall with Brad Pitt and Anthony Hopkins is based on one of his novellas. He died this month at age 78 while writing. While writing. Yeah, he's in the, well, he used to say about his poetry, he said, I have no illusions that people read my poems. Listen to this, I love this. He said, but for me, my poems are flowers for the void. We still have to grow those flowers, though, don't we? What do you want to talk about? What a nice looking group of human beings. And I'm wearing my good glasses. I can see. What's your name?
My name is Fran Hall. I'd like you to talk about endings. When did you decide to stop?
When do you decide to stop?
Yeah, when you were reading, there were probably 3 places where I thought you were going to stop, and you didn't. You kept going.
My wife says the same thing. Honey, shut up. There are like 6 places at dinner tonight. You could have just stopped. What? No. So I have a French named friend. I'm sure he caught his Irish. I think it's part of my issue. No, you have to really do, and look, all writing is hard, which is why I think writers love doing it. Beginnings are hard, middles are harder, and the ending is hardest. And for me, what I try to, it's Fran, right?
Yes.
I really hate endings with closure. I don't believe in closure. I don't believe it exists. I think it's an immoral word. There was actually a study done by psychiatrists, the big psychiatric body, and for psychiatrists, please don't be insulted, but they actually said, if you've lost a loved one and after 2 years you're still grieving, then it's now pathology. F you. Tell that to my friend who lost her 17-year-old son and will never hold him again. Right, so the endings, it seems to me that what I tried to do on my own, and I'm so goddamn close to this other thing I'm working on, that for some reason, and it's really harder with novels because you've got hundreds of pages and a bunch of characters and a bunch of storylines. I finally figured out that a lot of people hate my endings, though. I hate your endings. They don't say, oh, the ending, I don't know. They say, I hate how you end your story. But for me, it seems as if it's got to be more, I think about music, I'm not a musician, but somehow the last line and lines must resonate maybe the way a piece of music ends. Where if you've had a violin section and a brass section, there must be some tinkling resonance of them in the last line. And so for me, it has to be musical. But I was listening to Elizabeth Strout before I came up, and she's one of my favorite American writers, one of my favorite people. And, I love what she said. She said, I let it go where my mind goes. And, if I teach anything in creative writing classes, that's all I say. I do believe that the writing is largely the writer, and that the act of writing is an act of humility, where the writer is opening him or herself up to whatever's going to come. And it can be a terrifying ride. But I find time and time again, and I have to keep reminding myself that writing is terrifying. Even after all these years, it scares me so much. I have to keep reminding myself, if I just show up and open myself, it'll present itself to me. Like having a really good conversation, a difficult conversation with someone you love. Just show up, summon your nerve, and listen. Listen more than talk. That's my thoughts on endings. I've rendered them all quiet. What's your name? Oh, hey, my man, Justin, the great Justin Quinn. One of the finest blues harp players alive.
When we first met, you were bartending over here, and I was the cook over here. And we were talking about a mutual love of harmonica, and I asked what you were doing and what you were doing. And you said you were a writer, and I asked if I could read some of your stuff sometime. So after a little while, you let me read the 3 short stories that you had just, about to be published, the ones that had been out. And ever since then, I remember the one. I only read it the one time, and I still have the image of the guys sitting around the campfire at night, and they're drinking, and it's late, and they have the beating heart of this little animal.
Yes.
Was it a turtle?
It was an old loggerhead turtle.
Yeah, and that has stuck with me forever. Ever since that was a long time ago. So
I love you, man.
So I came back and said, "Oh, this is really good stuff." I really like the run.
That's so cool to hear, because this essay, I mean, that trip I took with my dad in 1988, I was working with Justin at Tent Center. He was cooking and thinking about going to Essex Avenue, learning how to cut hair, because restaurant life was taking too much out of him. Bartending life was taking too much out of me. I was thinking about going and getting an MFA and teaching, and here we are, man. Thank you, man. That's beautiful.
Your hair looks good, by the way.
He also cuts my hair. I need to make an appointment, though, man. Hi, what's your name? I know you.
Me, Susan LaFortune. Okay, so if you could have an intimate conversation with the younger Andre, the writer Andre, what things would you tell him to worry less about, and which things you would tell him to concentrate more on?
Good question. Good question.
Great question. Next question, please. No, that's beautiful. You know, honestly, I'll try to be very honest here. It's a great question. What would I tell the younger Andre to worry less about and spend more time on, less time on? I see with young people that I get to be around, including my kids, is there's... remember when you were young? Mm-hmm. You're just terrified of making a wrong decision about your life. But if I go here, then I'll never do that. If I open that door, then all those doors shut. And I'm screwed. If I marry him, oh my God. The truth is, there's a great line where a friend of mine got into the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London. He was, I quote this when I talk about character development, and he, wonderful stage actor, and he just did his performance, and his very famous British Shakespearean professor said, I won't do the accent, but the professor said to him, you know, Paul, that was a good performance, but not a great performance. Well, come on, I'm working my ass off. I'm doing everything you guys are teaching us. What do you mean it wasn't great? What do you mean? That's all I got. I don't know what to tell you, Paul. It's just none of us are one note. We're all a symphony. And I think I would tell that to the young Andre. Hey, buddy, don't just freak out. Relax. And, after writing my accidental memoir, Townie, I think I realized that a lot of my young life was operating out of fear. I always had like one psychic fist up, and I didn't trust that if you just, life's dangerous. I'm not saying you shouldn't defend yourself or be prepared to in all ways, but we can't live in fear. We can't. Our lives are so damn short. I would say relax, buddy. You can always quit that job. You can always break up with that woman. You can always throw that piece of crap you wrote into the fire. Oh, actually, this kind of lady, and then this lady. Yeah, hi, Patty. How are you? You look good.
You look as good as I was going to echo. Next essay, great haircut. I was studying it prior to it being mentioned. It's been so long, Andre. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to not just hear your words, but to hear you read your words.
Thank you.
And just let you know how great it is to, see it. It hasn't even been that long, but how much you keep growing. It's just it's so close to my heart.
Thank you. I have to brag about you, though. So this lovely lady, Pat, Patricia, was one of my first bosses in my early 20s when I decided, semi-consciously, I made one of these decisions, so you're not going to get a real job. You won't get a job where you get money and status and raises and promotions, because then that's what you'll do. So you're going to do jobs you don't want to do forever, so I started working for her. Cleaning houses and scrubbing toilets. And she's also a beautiful writer. Thank you.
Flattering that you need to remember. But yeah, you got more promotions than because you were the only one I trusted for quite a while.
I was not shy about cleaning other people's toilets.
Most of us were, but you were very good at all of it. There are so many memories I have of that time in all of our life together.
Okay, you're embarrassing me now. Stop. I'll hit you after. Thank you.
I'm hoping so.
Thank you. Who is, yeah, you? What's your name?
Jeanette.
Hi, Jeanette.
I wish I had an intelligent question to ask, but I just really just wanted to tell you, I've never heard you before. This is my first interview. My friend, had to come up. And I was so moved by that essay. It was
thank you.
so beautiful.
Thank you.
It was so beautiful. I just wanted to thank you.
Jeanette, thank you. I'm going on tour soon. I'd like you to come along. And like the third or fourth question, always do that. Thank you.
Hey, it's actually a follow-up question. I was also moved. I don't think there. I had some tears coming to my eyes listening to the various parts of the essay. It was so rich, and there were so many different themes. I think I was moved by the kind of story you're carrying, the story of your caring for your father, your family caring for your father, the themes of mortality. But I'm just curious. I would like to hear a little bit more from you about what your thoughts are. Was there kind of a central kind of meaning for you when you were writing that essay? What were you trying to communicate?
What's your name?
Danny.
Hey, Danny. Well, look, I've learned one thing over 30-something years of doing this writing habit daily, it's I really learned it always seems to go better creatively if I get out of the way. You know, Elizabeth Strout was saying in her talk that she learned that if you try to make her character go from the kitchen to the grocery store, it's going to be wooden. It's going to be forced. And again, back to this notion of writing as an act of humility. You know, there's a wonderful line from the late, great Grace Paley who said, "We write what we don't know we know." And Ian Forster, the Victorian novelist, said, "How do I know what I think until I say it?" So for me, I've learned, Danny, really, early on, I began to learn, like the first 10 years of early on, just back up, Andre, shut up. It's like a mantra in my head. You know the mantra really is in my head? Shh, just listen. And that said, I was very honored to have been asked this past year to judge the Raymond Carver short story contest. And so what they do, the guest judge is asked to write an essay about Carver's work. And I wrote the editor, "Hey, I got to introduce him to my dad. I think I'll write that." He went, "Yeah, my dad." And so again, it's really the central thing I love and fear most about writing is I never know what I'm doing. And so I just began with the image of getting ready to go down there and seeing my beautiful, beautiful father in his wheelchair as a captain of the Marines. You know, when he was run over, he was asked, how are you getting through this, man? He said 3 things: my children, God, and the Marines. And he shows up a lot in my dream world, my old man. You know, I didn't live with him growing up, but I live with him here. Thank you. What else? Hi, what's your name?
Lisa.
Hi, Lisa.
I had your dad as a teacher at Bradford College.
You are aging beautifully. Are you kidding me? I'm kind of shocked. He started teaching there in the 60s. Wow, good for you.
And I recently read Townies, and remember being as a student, thinking of you guys as Townies, and being fearful of you guys.
Yeah. Yeah, we were.
But it was a great privilege to have your dad as a...
He was a good teacher, huh? I mean, I've heard that from everyone. What's that? Yeah. Well, things have changed so much. He was a good teacher, and sometimes those advising hours kind of kept going on. He would admit it. It was a different time. It was a different time. Thank you. Yeah. It's good to meet you. What's your name?
My name's Irene.
Hi.
I just want to thank you for talking about Jack, because Jack and I go back to his UMass Gamers days. He is an aspiring writer. He's very, very humble, and I never knew that story about the book.
Well, you know, as I'm reading it, I Irene, I realized I gotta say this to Jack.
I feel honored. I feel connected to you even though I don't know you, but I know some of your mutual friends.
You know, Irene, it's a transitive theory of love. If A loves B and B loves C, then C loves C. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me. I have to say, I gotta let him know.
Jack knows that he's probably not even here. I'm going to, write to Jack and tell him about this experience. I can't wait to
Thank you.
Yes.
Jack was one of the heroes in my family life. No, look, when the divorce happened, where's the woman going to go? I mean, she was vilified, which ticked me off. People loved my dad so much, but when the divorce happens, someone's got to leave the house, and my father's third wife took the kids, but it was a really dark time, and Jack was the one who stepped in and said, "You need some help, man." And he moved in and lived with them for 9 years, and they were best friends. And I would say probably that was his closest male friend when my dad died. So, Irene, thank you for reminding me that I haven't shown Jack any of this, and I probably should. Hey, you're in a story that's in the world. What's your name?
You know me. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now?
Oh, Elaine. Elaine says, can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on? I can't, but I'll tell you why. There are a lot of writers in this room. Look, I have this belief that writing groups and MFA programs and conferences are really, really wonderful to a degree, and then back the hell away from them, because you got to do this alone. The same way a woman pregnant with a baby really does it alone. I don't care how supportive her partner is. I really believe that when a man or woman writer is writing a story, you're pregnant with that story, the way a woman is pregnant with a real baby in a real womb, and you just have to show up and get daily nutrients to it. And here's the thing. So I'm about to give birth to this beast, and I want a spinal, a C-section, and drugs, and I'm probably going to want to put it up for adoption and never even look at it. I mean, I will say this. I'm terrified of this novel. It came to me the way they do, a sliver of a situation. It was calling me, and I did not want to go there. I felt this, no, I'm not writing that. No, that's someone else. I'm not. But that dog kept scratching on that door, and so I've been writing something that I have not wanted to write for 3.5, 4 years, and I'm just shy of 700 pages, and it's probably 450 pages too long. And that's okay. Slice, 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 and burn.
My name's Paula, and
Hi, Paula.
dirty love is what I want to talk about, because I just want to thank you for the dark and horrid relationships that you write so well about.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
What's your first name?
Paula.
Hey, Paula. So my mother-in-law is one of my best friends. Her name's Mary, and she lives with us in an apartment in our house. And I've been with her daughter for 28 years, and she, I met her right after this thing in New York in '88. And Mary always reads myself. She's almost 95. She looks 62. I'm not exaggerating, right? She cleans, she cooks, she drives, she puts a skylight in for me. She's a little late, 100 times. And she read Dirty Love, right? This collection of books. She says, Andre, I don't know, all the men are cheating on my wives. I said, Mary, look at me, look in my eyes. I've never cheated on your daughter. I've been tempted. But I have never cheated, and I don't think she has. And so this is all good. It's fiction, my darling. It's imagination. But this whole notion of fiction as a fall into the dream world, it's scary out there, man. I mean, it's scary in here. I had a student at UMass Lowell, where I so happily teach, who I gave him all of them a creative writing exercise, and he wrote really, no, she wrote really compellingly from the point of view of a male killer. It wasn't sensationalized at all. You just felt she'd gone there and captured that. And then she was all freaked out about it. I said, no, man, relax. That's in all of us. All of us have all of these shades. And I think about D.H. Lawrence's wonderful line, it is not I who writes, but the wind that blows through me. So, but thank you, Paula, for reading that book, Dirty Love. For sale.
I love that.
That's terrible. I should go to this side. All right, no one's there. Okay, this man. David, how are you?
I just wanted to say thanks for being part of this community and for making you report part of what it is unique. It's been great coming session. It's been great having you be the person you are. I don't think anybody in the room thinks he's going slow. He's having fun, that's great. But he's not going slow. And I think you all feel that.
Thank you, brother.
We all really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you.
It's been, well, first, thank you for your words of inspiration. And I'm looking for some more words of inspiration. It's been 5 years since I've been in your classroom.
I have to brag on you. Before you say that, I'm just going to brag on this woman. Giselle is one of my many wonderfully blossoming graduates into life in UML, but she kind of came blossom. I did this, I'm just going to share something, and I think, hopefully it's okay. So, at the beginning of a 3-hour class, the whole first class of the semester, we just introduced each other the whole time. And I asked people questions, and that's when Giselle's turn, and here's this beautiful woman sitting here between two guys with their caps sideways and they're flinging their neck tattoos. I'm asking, well, what do you like to do? Giselle's your name? Giselle, what do you like to do? I don't know, I really love shooting my M16 at dawn. She's a veteran and a former Marine. Well, once a Marine, always a Marine. But she's also a beautiful fiction writer and nonfiction writer, and she's also now the Commissioner of Veteran Affairs of Boston. All because she took my path.
So yeah, now I have a job that I can actually afford an apartment that has a writing room, but it's hard to get to that writing room. So I'm looking to see when it gets that hard, what do? What have you done to get there?
Okay, that's I know there are other writers. Good to see. How do you get to that writing room? It's hard. And look, it is hard. And everybody in this room, if you're an aspiring writer, if you're writing a book yourself, you've written many books, you all know you have, every day, you have an incredible amount of really good reasons not to write. Like wife, husband, tuitions, taxes, mortgage, yard, dusty phone. Children, dog, cat. Grass could be cut twice in one day. But listen, man, the writer Thomas Williams, if you have not read him, you're in for a treat, won the National Book Award in '75 for his wonderful novel, The Hair of Harold Brew. He was asked, Mr. Williams, why do you write? He said, oh, that's easy. I write so that I would die before I'm dead. And I know this about you, Giselle. I know about a lot of writers. If you don't do it, you're not going to be you. Americans, we're kind of all or nothing. I'm not happy I'm leaving him. Well, I don't know. Get a hobby. Maybe it's not that bad. I'm overweight. I'm going to surgery. I owe $10,000. I'm declared bankruptcy. I mean, we're just all or nothing. I hate this house. Where's the gasoline? You know, you can get a lot done in a little. And I was just telling this to our oldest son, Austin, who's an aspiring screenwriter and is working on film. He's in Hollywood now. And I said, listen, man, I wrote all of my novel, Houses in Fog, 17 minutes a day, twice a day. In actually, Oak Hill Cemetery, next to the grave of Hylas T. Wheeler, who died in 1866 at age 33. The truth is, and we've talked about this, Giselle, but, you know, I want to catch all of this Strauss thing, but I was late because I had about, you know, I've got a bunch of Greeks coming over for Greek Easter, I've got to cook and clean, but I saw a 41-minute window. And I wrote a paragraph and cut 3 sentences and wrote one more. And I got a little blood to the baby. And I know tomorrow I can pick up before I have to get the lamb in the oven. And I can't impress upon everyone enough how much you get done. Goethe said, do not hurry, do not rest. Join.
Hi.
And then I should probably stop, huh?
I have a question for you. When writing a personal story and fictionalizing it, you know, your own story, fictionalizing it, how do you get yourself out of the way?
Yeah.
Or
are you doing that now? Are you writing your own story and fictionalizing it? How do you get out of the way?
yeah.
It's a huge question, and it's a good one to end on. I'm terrible at it. I am so terrible at it. The one that Justin talked about with the beating heart and the loggerhead guts, that came from a real life thing where I was hunting loggerheads with a bunch of old alcoholics, including my grandfather, and I was acting just as alcoholic at 19, getting over a woman, and we slaughtered a 150-year-old turtle, and that, we ate it for months. But that heart beating the guts of that slaughtered turtle for like 2 hours. And it's the only story, maybe one half of another one, that I think I almost pulled off with fiction. I discovered about 8 or 9 years ago, after many years of trying, that I seem to do a lot better as a fiction writer when I leave my life, right? And so I can't answer that question because that's really why I love essays. You know, it comes from the French to attempt or try. There are those things that happen to you that they're not a poem, they're not going to make a good short story, they're not going to show up in a novel. Just write it straight. My mother and I were talking on the porch, she had a tumor on her arm, whatever it is. Write it straight, sing that song. And so I find it's much better for me and a lot of writers I've worked with to leave their own life. Because here's the thing, it'll show up anyway. It'll show up anyway. Thank you all very much.